I think it's a good time to get started. Tonight, we're going to talk about perhaps my favorite topic when it comes to financial aid, and that's negotiating your financial aid award letter. I'm going to spend maybe just a really quick background on myself before we dive in. So my name is Chris. I co-founded a company called Juno about 7 years ago. I'll tell you a little bit more about it at the end, but the key takeaway is I've become an expert on most things related to FAFSA, Student Aid Index, negotiating financial aid awards, undergraduate student loans, graduate student loans, and repayment terms. So whatever question you have, it's likely that I've heard it before, and I'm happy to be helpful in any way that I can. We're going to spend the first 5 minutes walking through a quick timeline for financial aid award, so you can understand what things look like from filling out FAFSA all the way to paying for school. And then we're going to zoom into talking about merit-based appeals as the first of 2 topics when it comes to financial aid appeals in general. That's going to be a bit of a shorter section. We'll go through that for about 10 minutes, and I'll leave you with some tips and tricks for how you might increase your odds of successfully asking for more free money from the school. We're going to spend the bulk of tonight's conversation talking about something called needs-based appeal. And there's a lot of reasons why you might be able to appeal your financial aid award letter on the basis of need that might not be immediately obvious. And so we'll go through about 15 of those reasons in as much detail as I can. And hopefully by the end of that, you have a good toolkit to understand the various reasons why you might be able to appeal and how you should approach the financial aid office or the admissions office to maximize the likelihood that those appeals are successful. I'll spend about 5 minutes talking about Juno, and then again, Q&A for as long as folks need. Before I dive in, do you mind, could somebody just let me know if you can hear me okay in either the chat box or the Q&A box, just to make sure that we're all set? Great, thank you very much. So, general overview on the timeline for paying school, and I hope this is overall helpful. The 2025-2026 academic year covers everybody who's going to school in the upcoming fall through spring semester. So what that means is you start by filling out the 2025-2026 FAFSA form. There's a different presentation that we do on FAFSA that I'm happy that I'll send a link to as well. You may not have been there, but we did it a few weeks ago. And that's where this entire process starts. The form opened up last December. It's available to you now. About 1 to 3 days after you fill out FAFSA, you're going to get something called a Student Aid Index. By itself, this number means very little, but it's a number that the financial aid office uses to determine how much aid you and your family are eligible for. And we're going to talk a lot tonight about how you can appeal certain elements of the data that goes into your FAFSA form that impact that Student Aid Index, that impact the amount of aid that you can get. You don't have to remember anything that I said just now. We're going to go through that in a lot more detail. By now, most folks have likely already applied for college. And when you've gotten an admissions letter, you may have already received, or over the course of the next several weeks, are likely to receive your financial aid package. And that's the point at which you want to consider appealing it. And we're going to go through the different ways that you can appeal it. Around May, you'll decide where you or your children are going to school. And tuition is typically due in August or September for most schools. So if you have any remaining financial need, then you might want to start looking at student loan options from different sources in around that June to July timeframe. So tonight we're going to focus on the appealing financial aid component of this entire timeline. If you have questions about things that come before, I'm more than happy to answer them. And I'll make sure to send you some content tomorrow that covers a few of the things I spoke about that come before appealing your financial aid award. So let's start off with what happens once you get your financial aid award letter. I'd like you to think of it as just a first draft and not a final decision. Schools are used to many people trying to appeal their financial aid awards. Often it's a conversation that's simplified down to, is there anything more that you can do for me? While that might be effective in some cases, it's not the best way to go about it. And so the tools we're going to leave you with tonight are a comprehensive understanding of the different types of appeals that exist and the language and the reasons why you can cite for the financial aid office to reconsider how they're calculating the amount of aid that they'll allocate to you and your children. So, quick thing to kind of keep in mind here, people are often reticent, that don't feel very comfortable appealing or asking. And the bottom line is, if you're not asking for a little bit more help, the odds are that somebody else in the same class at the same school is. And if there is any extra funding left over from the school, or if there is the ability for the financial aid office to take something into consideration that they perhaps were not able to learn yet, then somebody else is going to get that funding instead of you. There's no negative ramification of asking for more help, as long as you're doing it in a polite way. And we're going to hopefully leave you with the tools to figure out exactly how to do that. So, see a question here really quickly on where do I find the SAI, which is the Student Aid Index, which is the number that's calculated based on the inputs into your FAFSA form. And there's a portion of your studentaid.gov dashboard that shows you the Student Aid Index number. So basically you log back into where you filled out FAFSA. And on your dashboard, you should be able to find it in one of the decks that I'll send out tomorrow. There's a page that has explicit instructions on exactly where to click to find it. And see this question, so I'll address it as well. Everything we're talking about now will be recorded. It is recorded. Tomorrow you'll get a copy of the slides, as well as the recording that we're going to go through tonight. So please rest assured that you'll get everything that you need. So the two types of financial aid appeals that are worth understanding are merit-based versus need-based, and both might apply to you. Merit-based is simply you or your student were stellar in high school, and there's a reason why the school wants that student to attend. And they want the student so much that they're willing to give a merit-based scholarship, which in another way is kind of thinking of it as a discount in order to go. There's a lot of reasons why we're going to get into in a few minutes. You can appeal that. A need-based scholarship or need-based financial aid it covers different forms of aid: scholarships, grants, work study, loans that we'll get into. And that's based primarily off of the data that you input into FAFSA. And so that really is primarily coming from federal government, sometimes some of it coming from state, and sometimes some of it coming from institutional money. So money that the school has to allocate for need-based aid. And we're going to spend most of tonight's discussion on that. To start off with merit appeals, this is where there's a lot of different opportunities to ask for a little bit more money. So the best situation is when you've been admitted to multiple programs and some program has offered you significantly more aid, merit-based aid, than the one that you really want to attend. And you're able to clearly communicate to the financial aid office, and in some cases the admissions office at the school that you want to go to more, that if they can help you make ends meet, they can help come closer to the amount of aid that you've gotten from a competitive offer that you would choose to enroll with their program. And so there's a tool that another partner of ours called Road to College has pulled together called Compare Offers. It's really interesting because what this does, if you go to that link, is it shows you, based on various inputs, the amount of merit-based aid that other families and students have been offered for the upcoming year per campus. And so you can go into that tool and see, based on your GPA and standardized test scores, how does your offer compare to what other people have been offered? And if you see that for a comparable candidate, somebody else has gotten a significantly higher amount of merit-based aid, then at least it can build a degree of comfort and confidence in you to know that perhaps there is a little bit more room to push and ask for more help. If you see that you're already at the very top of the range, then maybe it's a little bit more difficult for the school to be willing to grant you a higher merit-based aid amount. But having that context and that knowledge is key to knowing how far you might be able to push this. For anybody who joined just now, I'm not going to recap what we went through so far, but you haven't missed too much yet. You'll get a recording and copy of these slides tomorrow, and you can catch up for the first 10 minutes that we walked through. Then, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them and I'll answer them as we go along. As I was mentioning, this is a quick snapshot of what that tool looks like. So you can see, based on an individual school, someone's GPA, SAT score, when they applied, the amount of aid that they got to go to those programs. It's really interesting. There's thousands of data points in there, and I hope you find it useful. So when it comes to merit-based appeals, the negotiation strategy is going to dictate a little bit or quite a bit of your likelihood of success. Your primary way of doing this is going to be by writing a letter to either the admissions office or the financial aid office, or sometimes both. You can kind of choose who to reach out to in this scenario. Each school might do it a little bit differently, so there's not one blanket answer I can give you on who you should reach out to. So the first thing you want to do in the letter that you write, and in a moment I'll give you a quick template, is to express enthusiasm about that program. Schools care quite a bit about their yield rate, which is the percentage of people who they've admitted who then choose to enroll. And if you're able to communicate to, let's say, school A, that you're extremely excited about their program for these specific reasons, you really want to attend, but you need more help to make the numbers work because another program that you also like is offering you significantly more financial aid, then that creates a strong negotiating point. Now, the financial aid office perhaps would not like you to use the term negotiation, so refrain from doing that. But express enthusiasm, make them believe, and it should be true, that if you get more help, you will enroll. If there's been additional achievements or accomplishments since you submitted your application that they're not yet aware of, then it could be really valuable to let them know what those are so that they can take that into consideration. And you certainly do want to be very polite when you're writing this. Threatening to withdraw an admission in some form, this rarely happens, but I've seen it happen. It's not going to get you anywhere. And exaggerating a competing offer that's no longer plausible or believable also might work against you. So you can be honest within reason, express enthusiasm, let them know if something great has happened to you or you've accomplished something new, and that'll get you a very long way towards being in the upper tier of quality merit appeals. So there's a quick template that I have here. You absolutely don't need to use this. We just pulled something together that some folks have used over the years. Tomorrow, when you get a copy of these slides, you can click on Access the Template here, and you'll be able to just go to the Google Doc that hosts this, copy it, and change anything that you'd like to change. Hopefully, this will speed things up for anybody who is considering doing a merit-based appeal. I'm going to pause for a moment and just see if we have any questions, then I'll move on. There's a good question here on, can you negotiate after you have accepted? Really good question. It's much more difficult and less likely for you to be successful in negotiating merit appeals if you have already accepted the offer of admission and put a down payment, but it is not impossible. And the reason I say it's not impossible is I'm going to make up some numbers here and say a school has admitted 1,000 people and the class is 500 people. And some of those 1,000 people who were admitted were offered merit-based aid, but aren't ultimately going to attend that school. And so there is a pretty decent chance that as you get closer to the decision date for a particular school, there might be additional funds that are available for them to allocate to other people at the program. And so even if you, let's say, already have accepted the offer of admission and put a down payment, it's worth it to try appealing on the basis of merit. And if you hear no, then it's worth it to try again at some point in, let's say, the middle towards the end of April. Because the worst thing that can happen is that they'll just say no again. The best thing that could happen is all of a sudden the school realizes that it has more budget left to allocate because a lot of people that had offered merit-based aid to perhaps did not actually accept their offer of admission. All right, I'm going to go through this slide. I'm going to turn back over to a few really good questions. So really, when to do this? We just covered that. If you've received multiple offers at that point, you have a higher chance of success, but it is most effective if you do this before you enroll in any given program. If you don't hear something back after you send an email, but you follow up by phone, that can help. Just maybe wait a week or two because the financial aid offices are typically quite busy around this time of year. Sorry. The point of contact, who you should reach out to, typically the financial aid office, in some cases also the admissions office. Again, this is a little bit different by school. Who should reach out? For merit-based appeals, my recommendation is that the student directly reaches out. You want the student to be the one expressing enthusiasm about enrolling in the program. And if they're the one, it doesn't really matter if the parent or the student writes the letter, but as long as the student is the one sending it, it's more likely to be effective. And really the possible outcomes here are you'll get more free money that you don't have to pay back. Maybe the school counter offers and offers a little bit more, but not all the way up to what you wanted. It's really the most common thing that I've seen. Or you get denied and there's really no downside to this. You did spend some time, but they're not going to take any kind of negative action towards you if you're being polite about this. I'm going to flip back over to questions for a moment. There's a really good question here on, can you only negotiate if you've been awarded merit from other schools? No, you don't have to have been admitted to multiple schools to ask for more help on a merit appeal. You can simply just say, I really am interested in your school, but I need more money to make this work. I'm not going to advocate for making up that there is a competitive appeal, but nothing is perhaps stopping you from doing so. And there's a good question here on, is this information applicable to international students? That's really going to vary by school. It's that schools generally have a little bit less money that they allocate to international students, but some schools do actually offer quite a bit to international students. And so perhaps it's going to be very school dependent. I would still try this if you're an international student. Good question here on someone appealed for merit, got a little bit more money. And when they asked for a little bit more again, the financial aid office said that they needed to speak with the admissions office. And the question is whether I know people who've gotten more from the admissions office, but not from the financial aid office. Short answer, yes. A lot of schools will do this differently. So there's no one size fits all answer. But sometimes basically the merit aid budget that a school has to allocate can have different decision makers depending on the school that you're talking about. And it's impossible to know right off the bat. So for some schools, the admissions office would be the one that is in some form allocating that budget. In other schools, it's a shared responsibility between admissions and financial aid. And so it can help certainly to write the letter to both admissions and the financial aid office to maximize the likelihood that you get in front of the right decision maker. I don't believe that mailing a physical letter is preferable to emailing the same letter. I don't have an answer for yes or no. I have no evidence to believe that it would be. Writing the letter is the first step when reaching out. And there's a great question here on, could this work for a second year student? It's less likely, but it's not impossible. There are very few cases where I've seen that done, but it's also because very few people think to ask. So someone in some cases, I've seen folks who had a very strong degree of academic performance, non-campus engagement in clubs and other social activities in their first year of school and asked for a little bit of merit aid for their second year. And in some cases that has worked. And the way that I might frame this differently, that could be applicable to everybody, would be, look, if you're denied after you ask for more merit aid, it's very worth it to ask the question if there is any opportunity for more aid in future years. And if so, what would be the process to go about that? Sometimes you really never know what the situation is going to be. Neither does the financial aid office or the admissions office. There's a lot of volatility in the amount of funding that they might have available, and it's going to vary from one school to the next and from year to year. So you should kind of think of this as something that's worth doing over and over again, as long as you're willing to invest the time and expect that there is a low likelihood of success for future years, but that in the case of success, you just got a pretty sizable discount. So I'm going to move on to a few more questions, a few more slides, and then I'll return to anything that I haven't yet answered. So please, thank you very much for the engagement. These are really, really good questions, and I promise I'll get back. And so if there's any one takeaway from this, it's don't be shy or hesitant to appeal. If you're not asking for more help, many of the people in the class are. Remember that there's money that the school is allocating to people that it's admitted, and a lot of those people ultimately don't choose to go to that school. And sometimes that means that money is left over that could be reallocated to you. So if you try right now and you're denied, try again at the end of April. If you're denied at the end of April, ask if there's anything that you can do in the future to make to have an opportunity for merit-based aid, and say it along the lines of, I'm not expecting that this would be the outcome and not counting on it, but if there is any possibility or anything that we could do to have access to some merit-based aid in future years of your program, could you let me know? The people on the other side of the table are trying to help you as well, and they're trying to do it with constraint based on the number of people that they have to serve. And so if you're polite about it, if you can just follow up multiple times, there's a decent chance that something good could come of it. There's a good question here that I would love to talk about, is it true that state schools are the hardest to receive additional funding from when appealing financial aid offers? Uh, Depends on the state school, but it's a relatively fair assumption. It's also just not a universal assumption. So I don't want the takeaway to be don't appeal for a state school, but do recognize, and depending on what school you're going to, you should be able to do a little bit of searching and see if people have been successful in or get merit-based aid at all from those programs. But state schools typically do have more limited budgets. Not true of all state schools, but in the case of those limited budgets, they might be allocating their need-based aid, their whatever extra money they have to need-based aid over merit-based aid. Again, not true across the board, and it could change even the same school from year to year. So I'm gonna move on. One last question: are selective schools the hardest to receive additional funding from? Harder, yes, but when you think about merit-based aid, what the admissions office is trying to do is to create a cohort of students who will work well and learn well together. And in some cases, there could be something special and specific about what your child wants to study or their experiences until this point that would make them an extremely valuable addition to the upcoming class. And that could be different from one school to the next. And so you never really know who else has accepted admission to that class. And you'd never really know how important and additive your student could be to that new class at that school. And so it kind of just means it always makes sense, in my opinion, to at least try to ask for more and see what happens. All right, I'll have one more question here because I see someone else has commented on it as well, and then we'll move on to need-based aid, and then we'll go back to Q&A. So the question is, what other factors would schools consider when reviewing financial aid award appeals? Would engagement play a role in terms of school visit, attending webinars, events, and other things? And to be totally honest, I don't have a good answer to that question. I've always been curious myself. I've asked this of admissions offices at some graduate programs, and I haven't really gotten any consistent answer. And so I think really it is quite difficult to predict if demonstrating a higher likelihood of wanting to go to that school before the offer of admission is going to change the amount of merit-based aid you might be eligible for. But if these are things that you're going to do anyway, or that it's a program that you're really interested in anyway, and you're going to go on campus or join some of their events, it obviously can't hurt. Just to be respectful of everyone's time, I'm going to move on to where I think we're going to spend the next 20 minutes, and then I'll go back to things related to merit-based appeals. So need-based aid it's exactly what it sounds like. Based on the information that you put in FAFSA, the Department of Education calculates the number. We're going to go through it in a minute. That number is called Student Aid Index. The Financial Aid Office gets that number sent to them. And so that number in general just represents, we're going to go through it in a little bit, it's not your financial aid award amount. It's not how much money you need, but it's an index. The lower the number is, the more financial need is assumed that you need. The higher that number is, the less need your family has, according to the way the math works. But there's a really big problem, which is a lot of the information that you might want to share that's relevant to your family's finances is often not reflected in FAFSA. That number is calculated based on, in many cases, incorrect, outdated, or incomplete data that's being fed into the application. And we're going to walk through that right now. In need-based appeals, your job is to provide the financial aid office with new information or updated information that gives them a reason to go back and change the inputs that impact the amount of financial aid that you're eligible for. So I hope that's a helpful framing overall, and we'll keep going through it. So, sorry. Let's start off with just 2 minutes on how need-based aid is calculated. Then we'll spend a few minutes on the specific shortcoming for how the FAFSA form works. And then we'll spend the bulk of this conversation on the different reasons why you're allowed to appeal your need-based aid. And we'll end it with the process to go about doing that. You may be surprised at the various different reasons why you can appeal and how a lot of them apply to many more people than expect it could be relevant for. So whether or not you think that you're going to get need-based aid, at least give me 5 minutes to show you some of the key reasons that might end up being relevant to you and increase the amount that you could get. So to start off with, the math that every school is required to use to calculate something called your level of financial need. It's an official term that comes from the FAFSA form and through the Department of Education, is what you see on this slide. So you start off by taking the sticker price of the school at a number called cost of attendance, which includes tuition plus fees, plus room and board, and some allowance for living expenses. This number is published on each school's financial aid website, and we can think of it simply as the sticker price. And then you subtract something called the student aid index from that number, and the difference between those two numbers is your financial need. Once you have a number for financial need, the financial aid office is supposed to create a need-based aid package for you. And that package could be a combination of grants, work study, and loan. And so in this example, somebody is going to a school with a cost of attendance $20,000. They completed their FAFSA, and FAFSA calculated a student aid index number of 1,500. And so the amount of financial need that is calculated for that family is $18,500 for the upcoming academic year. This number can change each year because each year you have to submit new FAFSA application. So this $18,500, there's going to be a financial aid officer at the school who then has to say, okay, based on this, how do I follow a set of rules to allocate everything from Pell Grants, other grants called FSEOG, work study, something called direct loans that are available to the student, and Parent Plus loans if the total amount of what I've added up until now still leaves some financial need left over. I have a different presentation that we'll do in a few weeks that goes through how some of that is constructed. And if you have any questions about the logic the financial aid office follows, I'm happy to go through that now as well. But just know this is how the process works. What we're talking about in the upcoming slides is how do we provide new information to the financial aid office that can change that student aid index number that gets calculated so that the amount of financial need the office can consider is larger. So as I was saying, that student aid index number, it's based on what goes in FAFSA. And there's really 3 overall buckets of things that impact it. The first is information about income. The second is family asset values. And the third is the size of the family. And the problem is that in each of these 3 buckets, and in a few other ways, FAFSA provides an incomplete picture of many households' finances. And the appeals process here is going to give you the chance to give the financial aid office a chance to reconsider the way that they view what you input in FAFSA, as well as to potentially add on additional things that impact your family's finances and make less of your assets and income viewed as being available to help pay for college. So I'm going to give you 3 quick examples here that are pretty relevant to a lot of people, and then we're going to move on to the specific reasons why. So the first is data about income. When you filled out FAFSA, or if you're about to fill it out for the upcoming academic year, it's actually based on your tax returns from 2 years ago. So for the 2025-2026 school year, the income that the financial aid office is determining your aid amount off of is 2023. And in many cases, a family has experienced a reduction in income, whether that's somebody getting a pay cut or job loss or something else. And if any of those things have happened, then it's a great reason to let the financial aid office know so they can just change the assumption that's used for the amount of income the household has, which will flow through the math and potentially leave you with more financial need. And we'll go through that in a little bit more detail in a moment. Assets are the other really big bucket of things that the FAFSA form takes into consideration, but that's also incomplete because it doesn't take into consideration expenses that are unavoidable. And so in a few minutes, we're going to go through some of the different more common reasons why you can ask the financial aid advisor to reconsider the amount of assets that are available to help pay towards college. And one of the key ones is there's nowhere on the FAFSA form that you can explain significant medical expenses or chronic health conditions or other things that lead to unavoidable expenses for the family. And so just the way the FAFSA form works by default is it assumes that everyone in their entire household is in perpetual perfect health. And if that's not the case, as well as many other reasons, you have the chance to let the financial aid office know to reconsider. And the third overall bucket is issues related to family size. And an important one I want to hit on right now is the FAFSA form itself asks you a question about the number of people in the household who are enrolled or who will be enrolled in college in the upcoming academic year. That question has been on FAFSA for a long time. 2 years ago, the way the math works in the form was changed and the form was shortened. This question remained, but it's no longer used. It's a quirk of just how things were set up. So the reason why this is important is what the FAFSA formula is trying to do is say, based on your household's income and assets, there's a lot of adjustments that happen in the background. And then they say, okay, after all of this consideration, this is how much your family should be able to contribute towards college for one child. But if you have multiple children in school at the same time, or if you're the student listening to me now and you have siblings in school at the same time, the FAFSA form and the financial aid office have no way to realize actually the amount of money you said that we can pay towards college, that has to now be divided amongst 2 children or 3 children. And so we need you to reconsider the way that you're approaching this math. That is an extremely valid reason why you can appeal. And I hope this applies to you, that you make sure you do that, because even folks who might not otherwise be eligible for financial need could suddenly become eligible on this basis. I'm going to turn over to take a quick look at questions, and then we'll start going through this slide, which goes through a few of the reasons why you can appeal for changes in income or employment status. Good question here. Do you have to submit FAFSA each year? Yes. Whether your finances stay the same or not, every single year you have to submit a new FAFSA application to be eligible for federal and state-based student aid. Is it possible to pay zero for college after applying for or appealing financial aid? Yes, it is. And the specific example is if you're going to a school, especially one that has a lower cost of attendance, some of these need-based appeals could move you from being eligible for a small amount of Pell Grants and something called an FSCOG grant and work study. So think of these as three things that you could be eligible for. That in total could add up to, I believe the maximum number of this would be like $11,400 of free money plus work study up to typically $1,000 to $5,000. If the school that you'd be attending is kind of in that range for cost of attendance, then an appeal could make it so that you get access to 100% of that, and then the school would be free. If the school is more expensive than that, it's possible that some combination, that the school itself could have some merit, some need-based aid budget that it could allocate towards you. And so there's three ways that you can get need-based aid. There's money from the federal government, there's money from the state in some states, but not all. And then there's money from the school itself, institutional aid. Not all schools and not all states have a need-based aid formula or budget, but depending on where you are, it absolutely is possible that through the appeals process, you could go to school for free. Do schools get the SAI number or the whole FAFSA application? The school actually gets much more than the SAI number, and so they'll have a lot of the key inputs that have gone into your FAFSA form. And one more question here on, do you have to specify how much your income changed in the appeal? In general, that would be helpful. And you likely would be asked exactly for the amount that has changed. And so let me go through this slide, which might answer some of the questions around income, and then we'll return to more questions. So I'm gonna just go through 4 quick reasons why that are some of the more common ones. You can ask the financial aid office to change some of the income inputs in the math that they have to do. So if there's been a reduction in income, like we've discussed, since the year that was reflected in your FAFSA form, then you absolutely should let the financial aid office know. If there was let's say even if there was a reduction in income, let's say you made $100,000 in 2023, and that's what showed up in the FAFSA form. If you were unemployed for some point of time between 2023 and now, but let's say you're now making the same amount of money again, you should still let them know so they can take that into consideration. The most likely scenario for them to make a change to the amount of aid you're eligible for is if either you're currently unemployed or if there's your current salary is lower, or household income is lower than what was reflected in FAFSA. They will likely ask you for some documentation to indicate what that change actually is. And so you should be prepared to provide that to them in case they do ask. And what the financial aid office will do in this scenario is take that new number and effectively plug it into the formula that's used to calculate the student aid index number. And so if that number is lower, then a lot of math happens on the back end, and then that will calculate a new SAI, which will calculate a new level of financial need. For anybody who's interested, particularly in the nitty-gritty of how that student aid index number gets calculated, there's a different presentation that we've done that goes for over an hour into the exact math And so if you are interested, just maybe let me know in the chat box, and I'll make sure to send a link to that presentation in the email that I'll send you tomorrow. If there's been any kind of job loss in the household, please make sure to let the financial aid office know that. But just realize that resigning from a job is significantly less likely to be taken into consideration by the financial aid office. It typically is more so a layoff that they would consider as a non-voluntary change in income. That doesn't mean you shouldn't try, but just recognize that it's less likely. A much more common question than I personally expected is, say that your 2023 taxes had one-time income reflected in them, whether that's an inheritance, a sale of assets, some other thing that shows up on your taxes that is not representative of something that's going to repeat year after year. You really should let the financial aid office know and provide as much context as you can. From their perspective, all they see is a snapshot in time, and the way the formulas are set up is to effectively assume that the number they see from that snapshot in time is representative of what you'll make every single year. And if that's not true, it's absolutely, you just have to let them know so that they can make some adjustments and potentially reconsider using a different number for that income assumption. And that can make an extremely large change. I was speaking to somebody a few weeks ago who realized this after I ran through this presentation with her, reached out to the financial aid office, had them remove or totally reconsider the way that they were calculating the income portion, and it moved her from being eligible for zero aid to being eligible for a significant amount of aid. So please do make sure that if this applies, you take advantage of it. And if anybody is receiving child support, if there's been a reduction of the amount of child support received since the 2023 tax year, then you want to let them know. Because again, all they assume is that that amount is what is being paid every single year. They don't have a way to see new information since the 2023 tax year unless you give it to them. Sorry, we just skipped a few slides. All right, I'm going to flip back over just to see if we have some questions, and then I'll continue. All right, great. So Sabrina, I will, in about 5 minutes, we'll walk through where you can find the form to send an appeal. And I will make sure to send the presentation about how the SII is calculated when I send this to you tomorrow. And I see a great question here about someone whose father is a federal employee. The household has a high student aid index, but the job is at risk. And so, look, in this scenario, it is certainly challenging, and I think it is worth it to have a phone call with the financial aid office. If you work at any job, or your parents work at any job that is at risk of having that position eliminated, it's really it's a little bit more of a gray area. There's not rules that are set in stone, but it's worth having a direct conversation with the financial aid office about what you fear. And honestly, I think that at this point in time, especially for federal workers, they would be much more likely to take this into consideration and maybe even tell you, look, if something does happen, we can recalculate what your financial aid offer would look like in the future. And that's the step I would take. Submit your FAFSA, call the financial aid office or write them an email, let them know that this is the situation, and ask them what you can do to prepare for it. So we're going to talk quickly about large expenses that are not reflected in FAFSA. And so I'm going to go through these four a little bit more quickly for the sake of time, and then go back to Q&A. So as we were saying, the FAFSA application only has so many questions. If you have unexpected medical expenses, or ongoing medical treatment that you have to pay for, whether it's chronic disease or an accident occurred, whatever it is, you should absolutely let the financial aid office know what that is. They will likely ask you what amount your family has to end up paying, whether that's on a monthly cadence out of pocket or if it was a large one-time expense, so that they effectively change the amount of your family's available income and assets or available to help pay for school. Some examples are there has been some emergency surgery. A more common thing I hear of is chronic illnesses, or let's say a long-term illness or disability in the household that causes, or any kind of medical condition, to be completely candid, that requires your family to incur ongoing costs that FAFSA just doesn't consider. Another valid reason is if you're caring for an elderly or a sick family member. So that can be financially costly for most households. And so if there's costs that are related to in-home care, assisted living, you're the caretaker and you have to travel frequently for caregiving, and you have to cover a portion of medical expenses for somebody else in the family, please let the financial aid office know the full context of that situation. There's, again, not a hard and fast rule to exactly what they have to consider, but they have a lot of leeway. And if there's a large fixed expenses that impact the household that don't fall in these buckets, then you may be able to ask for more help. So if you have, let's say, a large level of credit card debt, or let's say the parents have student loans they're paying off from their own school and are now being asked to take out loans to pay for the student, you can at the very least let the financial aid office know that there are these required recurring financial obligations in the household that can't be avoided. And are they willing to take that into consideration in this need-based appeal? They're less likely to say yes and to provide you with more aid in this scenario. But again, the worst that you can hear is a no. This is the last slide on reasons you can appeal, and then we'll really go into the process for 5 minutes. So we touched on this a few slides ago. If there's somebody else in the household who's in college at the same time, please do make sure to appeal. You will likely be asked to demonstrate what the cost of attendance and out-of-pocket costs for that school is. So just be prepared to know if you have a sibling or another child who are getting a full ride at another school, much less likely that they're going to reconsider the amount of aid that the current child would be eligible for. But if you have to pay a lot out of pocket, let's say after grants and the merit-based aid for one child, it can significantly impact the amount of aid that you can be eligible for the second one or the third one. And so just make sure you remember that. Changes in family size can really swing the amount of financial need you're eligible for. When you filled out FAFSA, there's a question, it pulls in the household size that shows up on your 2023 tax return. And then there's a pop-up and another question that says, is this family size still accurate? And if your family has grown since those 2023 taxes were filed, please make sure that you put that new larger family size number on the application. The reason this is important is, and if you've forgotten to do that, then please do appeal. You can either adjust your FAFSA application on studentaid.gov, but you should also reach out to the financial aid office directly. The way that all of the math works in the presentation I'll send you tomorrow is a certain portion of the household's income is protected. It's viewed as not being eligible to help pay for college. And the amount that's protected increases as your family size grows. So please, if your family size has grown, make sure you have the correct assumption in there, because it will impact your student aid index number. And then, unfortunately, in the case of the death of a loved one or divorce or separation, since those 2023 taxes were filed and that household number was recorded, please do let the financial aid office know. These situations can be a little bit complicated, and they at least have the opportunity to reconsider how all of the math works for your student or for yourself. I want to just really double click on this point around FAFSA and household size and family size. So someone's asking, doesn't FAFSA and or CSS already ask for this information? FAFSA asks the question, but it doesn't use the answer. It used to use the answer more than 2 years ago. Now it still asks the question, but the student aid index number that you get, which impacts the amount of financial need that your family is being told that you have, it doesn't change if you answer that question as one child or 50 children. You have to let the financial aid office know what your situation is so that they can reconsider the way that the math works. There's no good reason. It's just the way that the law was written to come up with the simplified version of the FAFSA form. And I think it's silly that it works this way and that you have to appeal for this to be considered. But please don't assume that just because the question is asked that it actually is taken into consideration. So you want to initiate appeal on a need-based appeal by contacting the financial aid office. The admissions office isn't involved at this point. And the financial aid administrator who reviews your case has quite a bit of authority to make adjustments. They can either change the cost of attendance number, or they can change the student aid index number based on a set of rules. And that impacts the amount of financial need that your family is assumed to have. There's a few other things they can change as well, but I won't go into those right now. After they look at this, they'll let you know what their decision is. And you could actually appeal the appeal if they say no, because in this situation, if there's still new information that you need to provide, maybe you appealed a few weeks ago and you learned something new tonight, you can appeal an appeal. You will typically, so each financial aid office now actually is supposed to have a link on their website that shows you it tells you what the instructions are to submit a need-based appeal. Most of them that I've looked at do have this. In some cases, you'll be asked to send a letter via email with attachments that support your case. In some cases, there's a form that's embedded in your dashboard that you'll write this appeal letter in and attach attachments that support your case. Just check what that process is for your school. If you can't find the appeal form in either your financial aid dashboard or publicly on the financial aid website, just email the financial aid office asking what the process is for that school. And very important to remember that schools are actually now required to allow you to appeal for need-based aid. So they have to consider every appeal and a request for adjustment of either SAI or the cost of attendance. They don't have to accept your appeal for any of the reasons that I said before. There's something called professional judgment that's actually a legal term that's coded into what the Department of Education requires financial aid offices to use. And what that really just means is they have a little bit of leeway in adjusting the inputs that calculate the student aid index number and in potentially changing that cost of attendance number. And if they can raise cost of attendance or reduce SAI, it makes you eligible for more aid. And when you're eligible for more aid, make you eligible for many different types of programs from the federal government, the state, or the school. There's no guarantee, but really the worst that can happen is no. And I want to stress this point that you can appeal for multiple years. So because you have to submit FAFSA every single year, you'll have a different set of numbers that the financial aid looks at each year when deciding how much need-based aid you're eligible for. And so even if you're not eligible now, if something happens next year or in 2 years, make sure that you do appeal based on all the principles we've discussed now. If there's been a change in employment, if you think that based on what you know now about what the financial aid office can see when they get your application, that the information they see is not fully covering your family's financial situation, make sure to appeal that next year and the year after. All right, and I'm going to just cover 5 really quick reasons you probably can't appeal. If there's been a change in the value of your 401k, your retirement accounts, or other investments, they're not going to take that into consideration. If a parent does not want to help contribute towards a student's education and the school is telling them that the only option available to them is that they can give as a Parent Plus loan from the federal government, that's not going to impact the amount of aid that you're eligible for. And so I wouldn't necessarily try this. Bear with me for just 2 more minutes and I'll be done with my portion and I'll go back to Q&A for anything more that you'd like to know. A quick overview here. There have been a lot of announcements and headlines about potential changes to federal loans and grants and potential pauses. I want you to just cover at the top that those were not intended to impact federal student loans and federal grants that are available through this need-based aid process. There's one thing that might be discussed over the next few weeks that you might start seeing some headlines about, and that this whole need-based aid process, it makes various families eligible for something called a Parent Plus loan, which is a loan that parents can take from the federal government to help pay for the remaining amount of need after scholarships and grants are taken into consideration. There is some discussion about sunsetting that program over the next 2 years. And so even if you do hear headlines about that, just know that it very likely does not impact anybody for the upcoming academic year. And if there are any changes that we do hear about, we are going to host kind of like an emergency webinar that will cover any changes that we get a good pulse on. And then finally, for 1 minute, just quickly about Juno. My goal is for everybody to try to get as much scholarships and merit-based aid and federal grants as you can so that you don't need any loans at all. And I say this as somebody who started a company called Juno to help pay for my own MBA. I started it because one of my classmates and I were looking at different student loan options about 7 years ago, and we didn't like what we saw. There is a federal plus loan we were eligible for, but the rates were very high. We wanted to see if we could convince some lenders to give us lower rates if we brought a large group of people to them. And so we bundled together about 500 people at that time who were getting their MBAs and asked a few different banks if they'd be willing to provide better rates in terms to each person in our group than we could get by going directly to those banks. And so in some ways forming a Costco or union type club for student loans. That's grown to about 200,000 people across all schools in the US. And our objective is pretty simple. If you're willing and at all interested, we could use your help to increase our negotiating leverage for this summer. The way it works is we don't ask you to pay us anything. We don't obligate you to do anything. We don't share your information with anybody. We just ask people if they're willing, if there's any chance that they might need a loan for the summer, to join what we call a negotiation group before April 30th. In that, you're just telling us where the student is going to school, and if they don't know yet, that's fine, and a graduation year, and a few other things that are optional to answer. And we're able to use the number of people who express interest in this to get more banks and credit unions excited about trying to provide a great product to our members. And then we make that available to people on June 1st. At that point, we basically just send you an email that shows you where you could check what rates to be eligible for. I'll tell you to compare that to what your various other options are. And I'll strongly encourage you to go around and shop around. If you like what we're able to deliver through this concept, you can use it. If you don't, it doesn't matter at all. But what I need is a little bit of help to increase the amount of negotiating leverage we have by having more people who express interest in this process. So if you are interested at all, I'll send you, you can sign up here. There's a link on this page and I'll send it to you tomorrow by email. Whether you use this or not, my team's available every day of the week, pretty much, for free one-on-one support. We do this all year round, pretty much the only thing we do. And so please do feel free to either reply to the email that I'll send you tomorrow, or call us at the number that I'll share with you tomorrow, or book time with somebody on our team on Zoom with any question you might have. And I'm going to return to Q&A. So somebody's asking, what if you have an increase in the household size that hasn't been reported on taxes? So that's the exact scenario in which you should appeal. Your taxes from your FAFSA is based on taxes from 2 years ago. It doesn't matter if you filed taxes more recently since then. It's always based on whatever your taxes were 2 years prior to the academic year that you're looking at. And so that's the household number that is automatically pulled into your FAFSA form. There's one screen that asks you to update that number if your family has grown, and people will often click through that screen more quickly than they should. If that might have happened, go back and look at your FAFSA form, your studentaid.gov account. But that's your opportunity to change that number before the financial aid office gets their input. If you made a mistake, just contact the financial aid office now and let them know. Fantastic question. So when you say the administrator has authority to change your student aid index number, do they have does that change your student aid index for all schools or just for that college? Just for that college, unfortunately. So when you do a need-based appeal, the results of that appeal are only valid for that school. They don't apply to any other places that you might have been admitted to. I know that that's imperfect and that it can be frustrating, but it just is the way it is. So make sure you know that. If you had a successful appeal at one place and then you decided to go somewhere else, make sure you very quickly let that other school know, submit the same appeal and also let them know that another school has already accepted it, so that they're more likely to take into consideration. There's a question here on what would be my recommendation for appealing a requirement to live on campus to be able to save money. I don't have a good enough answer that I could confidently state, and I wouldn't want to lead you in the wrong direction. So unfortunately, I just wouldn't be able to answer that. If you have a reason to appeal for both merit and need, should the student send one letter stating both reasons, or should they make those reasons, those appeals separately? This is a really good question. So if you have a reason to do both, in most cases, I would do it separately, to be totally honest. You want to Your need-based appeal is a different set of decision-making criteria than the merit-based appeal. And so you kind of almost want to have two separate bites of the apple here. Now, there's no, I'd say, 100% right answer to this. This is really just my opinion based on a little bit of experience on this topic. But the merit-based appeal is really something that you want to do a little bit more quickly, and you want to try again before the decision deadline. If you got a denial the first time, if you decide to enroll in that school, just try again. The need-based appeal, I'm hoping after this presentation, kind of already know whether or not you should do this appeal and the reason why you would select to represent to the financial aid office. Really, the moment that you know the answer to that question, the moment you know what you're going to tell them, you should appeal. Even if let's say you haven't received a financial aid letter yet that tells you the amount of need-based aid you're eligible for, I would already start that appeal process. And the way I would discuss it with the financial aid office, say that you're aware that there are things in your family's finances that are not well accounted for in the FAFSA form, and you'd like them to consider these additional things. Although you haven't received your financial aid award letter yet, would they be willing to take these into consideration before they pull that package together? There's no guarantee that they're going to listen to you now, but just letting you know, you might be able to do that pretty quickly as well. Question here on, does the student or the parent sign up for Juno? It can be either. It doesn't matter. It could also be both. All you're going to get from us really is just an email once a month. You'll get at first a handful of emails with some content that might be valuable, and then after that, an email once a month updating you on the status of the negotiations until June 1st, and then we'll make things available to you. Question on, how does Juno make money if everything we offer is free? Great question. And so to be completely upfront, we make money from our lending partners based on the total amount of loans that we're able to bring to the table. Up until now, we've done about $1 billion worth overall. And most of what we do is actually for MBA students, lawyers, doctors, dentists, and pharmacists. And a lot of the effort that we're putting in now is really trying to provide some of these resources around FAFSA, Student Aid Index, and appealing financial aid awards to undergraduate students and their families, so that hopefully in a few years, when you're at a great law school or medical school, you might find us as well. But if we can be helpful for you as a potential alternative to a Parent Plus loan, and I say potential alternative because I still end up telling most people that they should be using a Parent Plus loan, but there are cases where someone is able to get better rates through a private lender than they can get through Parent Plus, depending on what their credit is. And so there's a different presentation that we'll do in 2 or 3 months that goes through the decision-making process for just understanding, is there any scenario in which it makes sense for you to consider the Juno product for the upcoming summer? For most people, it's a maybe, and for some people, it's a strong yes. For the need-based appeal, is it okay for the parent to appeal, or is it better for the student to do this? So say the merit-based appeal, the student should do it. For the need-based appeal, really, it can be either, but this is where it makes a little bit more sense for the parent to do it. Often, the parent is the one who has more knowledge about the specific, let's say, changes in finances that they want to communicate to the financial aid office, and that in some cases, maybe it's just sensitive info and you don't want the children to necessarily know everything. And some financial aid offices, just as a warning, I've seen have required the student to be involved in or to lead that process. but in most cases that I've seen, it would be the parent welcomed as providing that new information. It's a good question here. So for anybody who's an international student, you can't fill out FAFSA. There's very, very few exceptions. But let's say, as a general rule of thumb, you're not eligible to fill out FAFSA to get federal student aid. And a need-based appeal for international students is really going to be limited to the schools that have an institutional need budget that they're willing to allocate to international students. So I'd say, to my knowledge, most schools don't have a need-based budget for international students. And if for those that do, you're either filling out the FS profile, which is a different kind of like FAFSA, but limited to a few hundred schools, or you're submitting a different form of financial need application for that school specifically. And if the school, each one might have just a different process for whether they would consider an appeal in that case. They just tend to have smaller budgets, so it's less likely that you would get anything out of it. Quick question here on for a loan taken out with any of Juno's lending partners, can the student start paying off the loan after graduation? Or do you have to start paying the loan immediately? As a general rule of thumb, for almost all private lenders, there's up to 4 different ways that you can repay the loan. And you almost always have you select this before you actually take the loan. And one of the options is typically to defer making any payments on it until either 6 months after graduation or 9 months after graduation. That varies depending on the lender. So there are just different options, and I'll make sure to go through those in a lot of detail in a few months. Great question here. If you appeal need-based, is it possible that instead of increasing your financial aid, the college decreases your financial aid because you share some information that made the college think you can pay more? There's only one situation that I can think of where that would happen. And really, if you had a change in income that was to the positive side, then they're still likely not going to take that into consideration. They wouldn't really care if your 2023 income was 60,000 and now you're making $100,000 a year. If that shouldn't increase the amount of aid that you're eligible for. Sorry, that shouldn't increase the amount that they'll ask you to actually pay. But that's really, it's possible that if they looked at the totality of your family's finances and you said, we have these additional medical expenses that we'd like to consider now that were reflected in the FAFSA, the financial aid officer might then say, okay, well, now you make twice as much money as you did based on what the inputs we use to calculate the amount of aid you're eligible for. And so I'm sorry that you experienced these additional costs, but you are not going to be eligible for more need-based aid. That's a possible scenario, but I would not, and you should not expect that in this need-based appeal process, there's really anything new that's going to change the amount of aid, but would make you have to pay more out of pocket. I just want to carefully caveat that because this is the quick answer. There might be some specific scenarios around inheritance or something new that could change the math, but as a general rule of thumb, it's pretty true. Good question here on, in order to qualify for free college, let's just say maximum amount of financial aid, is it enough to apply for just FAFSA? Do you need to apply anywhere else? So 2 answers to that question. One, some states could have a different version of a form that they would ask you to fill out as well. If you're going to college in that state and you want to be eligible for aid in that state. And this primarily applies to DACA recipients. And so California and Texas and other states have a version of a form that you may also be asked to fill out or to fill out instead of FAFSA. And I mean, really, a DACA recipient typically can't fill out FAFSA, and so you would fill out the version that the state has. And then there's about 270-ish, if I'm remembering the number right, schools that ask you to fill out the CSS profile, which is really just a more detailed version of a financial aid application that those schools use. And it tends to be some of the more selective schools for admission. And many of those schools require you to fill that out or to consider you for some of their need-based aid programs. And so some of the schools that have the most generous need-based aid policies, there are some schools, as you might already know, where if your household income is below X dollars, the student attends completely free. Many of those schools do require you to fill out that CSS profile as well. And they're generally very good at communicating that after you've been admitted. So I wouldn't be too stressed out about whether you're missing a form yet. Just make sure that you've filled out FAFSA first. And if you go to a CSS school, you should probably already be aware that you would need to fill it out. Good question here on would it help to have a professor write a letter of character when requesting merit-based aid or more merit-based aid? There's no very good answer on this. I can only say that it wouldn't hurt. It's possible that it could help. And if this person is willing to do it and it won't be too difficult to ask, then I would err on the side of asking to do it. Especially if they know this person, your student or yourself, and they can provide more color to the admissions office about why this person is going to contribute a lot to the upcoming class on campus. That might make that candidate seem even more attractive to the admissions committee and then hopefully allow them to reconsider the amount of merit-based aid they could provide. But again, there's no way to know. And so just kind of err on the side of try it. There's very little downside other than having to make that ask. There's a question here on, let's say, what if some of the activities happening right now in the federal government would curtail or shut down the Department of Education? What impact would that have on getting need-based financial aid from private colleges? This is my very honest answer based on studying this very closely. Even if the Department of Education by itself cannot be disbanded by DOGE. There are negative things that can happen to the number of people who work there, but the only discussions that are actually happening right now, even if it was theoretically shut down, are about moving existing functions to other parts of the federal government, such as moving the student loan portfolio to the Department of Treasury or moving other functions to the Department of Labor. And so what we're talking about, the things that you're eligible for through a need-based appeal and through FAFSA are written in law. Your access to the FAFSA application, the school's requirement to accept an appeal, the way that Pell Grants are calculated, the amount of federal student loans that you're eligible for. All of these things are in statute. What the Department of Education exists or not, there would have to be major changes to federal laws for any of the things I just described to be put in danger. And so I hope that that's helpful. There is a lot of clickbait that, because an alarmist view on some of these things does get more responses than providing the more sober assessment that it's more likely than not, very little, if anything, at all changes. But that's honestly what I would, let's say, tell my own parents in the situation, or to tell my friends. I wouldn't worry yet about any of these changes. It would actually take a material act of Congress that would be extremely difficult to happen for anything negative to happen there. And there's very little appetite for that at the moment. And to Margaret's question, the appeal letter template that I walked through, there's a merit appeal template that I showed about an hour ago. That will be sent tomorrow to your inbox as well. And so I'll make sure, just to recap for everybody, tomorrow I'll send a copy of this presentation, a recording of the presentation. I'll send you the math on how student aid index is calculated. And I'll send the appeals template, as well as a few of the other things that I pointed out in this call. I'll also send you contact information for our team. So if there's anything that you want to ask that you've not been able to ask yet, you'll be able to do it then. And we'll make sure to get back to you as quickly as we can. With that, I am going to wrap up, but please don't hesitate to reply to that email tomorrow. I promise we'll actually get back to you, and we'll try to be helpful in any way that we can. Thank you very much for taking an interest in financial aid. It's been honestly what is so early on in the process. And for those of you who are still here after 90 minutes, I appreciate the engagement a lot. And I hope you have a great rest of the evening.